Okay. Attempt 2, because we had a nice giggle fit because my girlfriend's trying to play Plants vs. Zombies. It's Wednesday, my dudes.
It is Wednesday, my dudes.
Which means it's going to be podcasting cars. Not that this is actually podcasting, although we are in a car, which is great. Anyway, so I thought for today's topic, I'd refer back to Friday's video where I mentioned how in some scenarios, bought is better than built. And I thought today's podcast could basically be about that. So, I have a script that I've written down a few points because my phone is obviously recording me, so I can't use my phone to read my script. So, I've got a couple of points, and we're going to read through them, and I'm going to talk about them and stuff. There is a weed whacker going on somewhere in the background, so if that's a little bit annoying, I apologize, but I should be more vocally present than that. Anyway, let's get on to today's video. So, in that video, I mentioned how a bought car should always really be like more reliable than a built car. Now, admittedly, I kind of misspoke in that video because that was just a very short video, or a very short explanation on this topic. I was so more meaning, if I have to use drag cars for an example, a 1,000 horsepower Tesla Model Plaid thing will run a set drag time. Now, if you had to go build a Nissan GTR or a Supra or something like that to run similar times, obviously that's a lot more horsepower that now you're going to have to now put through the engine on that car than what that car came out with from factory. So that's in those examples of extreme horsepower jumps. The car only made 250 from the factory. I'm speaking about a 2J. It probably made more. I think it was like 280 or something like that from factory. But my point being, from 280 even, or let's say it was 320 to be generous, 320 horsepower to 1,300 or something, so it can run the same kind of competitive times. That's a very large jump, and those kind of jumps, the car will not end up being reliable. It's too excessive amounts of additional power going now through the car. If we're talking about a little Miata that's barely running even a bar of boost, and you know it's got like 200 horsepower now versus its factory 90 horsepower, but admittedly the engine was originally designed to be a turbo engine and so on and so forth, that is a lot more acceptable, inverted commas. That will end up still being reliable because the engine was already kind of spec'd to be able to do that. You're not putting excessive amounts of power through the car. It will handle it, basically, is my point being. The car will be able to hold and handle that kind of abuse. That's more so what I was meaning, that on the higher horsepower level, the more extreme examples, that's where that kind of takes place, of which kind of flows into my next point of the cost. Because while hold on, let me just refer back to my notes here. Sorry. Yes. Was it? I don't know, whatever. Moving on. So, in terms of the cost though, it depends like kind of what the car is built for. Because again, if you're taking a car that only really made 280 horsepower plus minus from the factory, and now you're trying to ask it to make 1,000 and something plus, the cost to get it there is probably going to be a lot more aggressive than the cost of just buying a car that kind of has that horsepower from the factory. Obviously not many cars have 1,000 horsepower from the factory, but my point being, let's say then a slightly modified Supra that only has 800 versus a stock Ferrari, Lamborghini, whatever, that has 800. It will just end up being a lot more money that you're going to have to put into the Supra to get it to that point, because you're going to have to forge the internals and blah 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 blah. Also all the tuning and blah blah blah. Whilst the upfront buying price of the car that makes that horsepower just straight out the box would most likely end up being cheaper. But now I do want to just reiterate, this is kind of like a 50-50 scenario. Depends on the car, depends on what car you're versing it against. For example, you know, maybe to get a Miata to make 300 horsepower is actually relatively cheap, whilst getting a Mustang to straight out the box that has the same horsepower numbers is also relatively cheap, but maybe the Miata ends up being cheaper, so then built is actually cheaper than being bought. But maybe a 800 horsepower Supra versus a Ferrari that has 800 horsepower. I don't know why I keep referring to Ferraris, but anyway, the Ferrari might end up actually being cheaper in the long run. Now again, 50-50 shot, plus minus. It also kind of depends on horsepower level again, because if you're pushing extreme amounts of horsepower, you're most likely going to land up breaking things like gearboxes, diffs, something on the internals, blah 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 blah, and then that adds to the cost because you're going to have to continuously replace those things. So it's a 50-50 shot. In that scenario, it is actually a 50-50 shot if it costs more or not. Again, it also depends, because I could argue on a track day my little turbo Miata will clearly outrun a Mustang, even though I've got less horsepower than a Mustang, and my car definitely costs a lot less than what a Mustang does. So there I could say yes in terms of the bought situation. Not bought, sorry, built. But in terms of the built situation, the Mustang would probably be faster than me on a drag strip, or on a set of light-to-lights, you know, basically not cornering. A Mustang would probably land up being faster than me because that's a modern car with launch control, traction control, blah 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 blah. So then it would land up probably being in favor of the bought car. Oh my word, because they both start with B, my brain is like not computing. It also kind of depends, because if you take, for example, a Bentley Continental GT that has massaging seats and leather seats and warming this and climate control and cruise control, and it can drive itself and all of these fancy technologies, but now I want the same luxuries in a Miata, it would obviously cost a hell of a lot more for me to make my Miata basically a Bentley rather than just buying a Bentley. So again, it is a 50-50 shot. A reason why a lot of people prefer the built over a bought is because when you buy a McLaren, I'm going to start using McLarens or Lamborghinis now as an example because I've used Ferrari enough. If you buy a McLaren, for example, you're kind of stuck with how McLaren designed their car, which will be, it's meant for the guy that will occasionally go to like a track day, but he is more so about, like, you know, just going on the highway with it on a weekend and cruising like that. Whilst, you know, we'll build a car specifically for autocross racing, like I've done, or specifically as a daily driver, kind of what I've done, so on and so forth. We can build it specifically to what we want. So if I want a shorter shifting gear, or a shorter throw, I can spec that out. If I want a slightly smaller steering wheel, I can get a slightly smaller steering wheel. If I want a Bluetooth radio, I can get a Bluetooth radio. Whilst a McLaren is kind of spec'd with what a McLaren has, unless you're willing to pay extras and extras and extras. But then it starts, like the McLaren then starts to leave the bought territory and starts to go to the built territory because you're building it to what you want it to be. I'm more so meaning just buying a Porsche GT3 RS from the factory as is, and now you're going to go track race it. A car that you've built from the ground up, firstly, you probably end up being a lot more familiar with, meaning that you'd recognize, oh, there's a noise. Oh, I know exactly where that noise is coming from, and I know exactly how to fix it. Whilst if your Porsche starts making a noise, you're probably going to have to go drive to the Porsche dealership and say, sir, please help. So my point being, on the built side, it helps with familiarity, and it helps with you'll learn from it, and it's to your spec because you've purposely done it how you'd want. There's a car driving past, but I should be loud enough I can speak over it. Another point on what attracts people to the built side rather than the bought side is you can be more unique. Obviously, just as Miatas, for example, yes, there is a couple thousand Miatas that all have the generic Jeep halos in it, with a generic front lip that you always see, the generic bumper cut that you always see, the generic roof lip that you always see, and the generic boot lip that you always see, the little ducktail. And they're all plus minus running the same rims as well. It just depends on what color it is, really. So, I mean, you do get your generics. However, they're still very unique cars, because I mean, my car has a similar but different lip, similar but different headlights. It will have similar roof wing and boot lip wing, but slightly different. I have specs and versions within specs and versions, if that makes sense. And I believe that's what attracts a lot of people to the built side rather than the bought side, that there's just so many there's so much variety and options to look into to build the car how you want. Again, all those cars that I mentioned, and this is just for the NA Miatas, there's guys with ITBs, there's guys with superchargers, there's guys with turbochargers. Then within that, there's guys that have it running 200 horsepower, 500 horsepower, 600 horsepower for a drag car with semi-slicks on the back. Then you've got the guys that have they've built it for autocross, or maybe full on track racing, so it's slightly more top end speed than it would be for an autocross build. Guys that have built it for drifting, blah 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 blah. There's so many variations and specs that you can go into. The S chassis, I don't know why I inverted commas there, sorry. The S chassis community is one of the best examples of this, because you've got guys that autocross them, you've got guys that track race them, you've got guys that mainly drift them, you've got guys that street drive them and daily drive them. And each of those cars has like 100 variations within that on how it's built. Is it a pro-end car, or is it just like a casual street drift car kind of setup? Has it got hydro? Is it just a normal car? Is it a dog box, like a sequential, or is it still a manual gearbox? There's so many variations within that, and that again follows into, it's built into the spec that you want it to be built into, and that just makes your car so very unique. I have a one of 4 headlights in existence, my headlight kit. If anyone's interested, I have a link down in the bio, please go buy them, thank you. So, you know, that's a unique piece of my car and my kit, and it makes my Miata stand out not only to all the other Miatas here in the country, but to other Miatas across the world. So, I mean, I don't know, that's a very big appeal. Another argument for the build side, I'm going to be honest here, most of my script is towards the built rather than the bought, but that's more so because I've experienced the built side of it rather than the bought side, because I don't have the money to go buy a couple $1,000,000 supercar or sports car or something. So another argument for the build side is that they're more fun. Again, this is down to variation and so on and so forth, because that old man is giving me a real dirty look. I don't really know why. You probably will be a lot more willing to thrash your S chassis or Miata or whatever, that yes, you've poured a fair amount of money into, but you'd probably be more willing to throw it around than a guy who's just bought his Lamborghini or something. Now, again, that is plus minus, because I do know people who've bought supercars or sports cars or whatever, and they're still more than willing to go throw it around a track day, full send, like no shits given. They'll go put the car on the wall and they won't even think twice about it. There are people out there that are willing to do that with supercars. My meaning is, as a majority, guys with, again, the built cars are probably more willing to accidentally put it in a wall, and then because they know that they can go buy some parts, fix it up themselves, and they'll look forward to it, to be honest with you, as they're like a weekend project. So I think there's a lot of I don't know how to describe it. It just lands up being a little bit more fun to own, because you're more willing to hurt the car accidentally, because you know you can fix it. Again, also depending on how familiar you are with the car, and it would make you familiar with the car. One of the best examples is obviously like an initial D, where you drive the car until it blows up, and then you fix the car, so that you know where the limit is, and then you know, okay, I've upgraded that limit has now been raised, and then you learn the car from there. Whilst a car that you've gotten out the box, it's kind of at that limit, and then that is the limit, although the limit is a very high limit to begin with, so you have a very long way to work your way up. Whilst for a Miata, there's not much room to move about in. There is a helicopter, and it's being loud. Anyway, moving on to the next point. Another argument against the Bolt is actually some companies won't allow you to modify their cars. A very popular example of this is Ferrari, again, being very sticky on what you can and can't do in terms of modifying their cars. I know you can literally straight up just be banned, and you're not allowed to take your car to any Ferrari service center to be serviced. You're not allowed to buy any more Ferraris, stuff like that. Now, that is a very extreme example, because I know other companies aren't necessarily that fussy about it, but it is something to take into consideration. Obviously, Mazda has very little against people turbocharging their Miatas and doing random crap with them. I do guess that is more so from the fact that these are such older cars. But if we had to take the new Mark 5 Supra, or the Nissan 400Z, I know it's actually just called the Nissan Z, but everyone calls it a 400Z. I know, okay? But when I said 400Z, you know which one I'm talking about. My point being, those cars you can buy literally right off the car immediately, and wide body it, make it a drift car with an angle kit, and go absolutely ham with it, boost it and whatever. And yes, Nissan or Toyota may not be willing to do anything under warranty, but if you need to still buy a stock Nissan, Toyota, whatever piece, they will most likely still sell it to you. Like, they're not going to be fussy about it like Ferrari maybe, and then they're going to say, okay, well, gonna pull that. So again, it does depend on the dealer, and it does depend on blah blah blah, but it is something to consider. I know for Ferraris, I don't think you're allowed to modify it whatsoever. I think, I know they have the biggest issue, and where a lot of people get the envelope of impending doom, I don't know what you want to call it, from Ferrari, is when they modify the badge. You're not allowed to modify the badge. Whilst there tends to be a little bit more lenient if you do body modifications, although I have heard of people who've done like wraps and a wide body kit, and then Ferrari comes after them. Although I also know of people who've done wide body kits and or a wrap, and then Ferrari's got no issue whatsoever. I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you, I'd probably have to do a lot more research into that to speak on it clearly, but it is a point to consider. An argument again for Bought is obviously some countries have complete issues with you modifying your car. If your car has a certain amount of emissions from factory, your car should not produce any more than the emissions that it came out from factory with. So that is a bigger argument, obviously, for bought cars. Now, obviously, where a lot of this argument comes from is in California, where they have very big issues. But I'd like to point out that California's rules also make no sense, because I know they have obviously a limit, like a sound limit on how loud your car can be, as well as how much emissions it's allowed to produce and stuff. They've got limits and caps. Certain manufacturers don't meet those requirements from factory, so a factory spec won't even meet that. But now it's a particular state within a country. Like if the whole country had an issue with it, then Lamborghini or Ferrari or Porsche or whoever would say, okay, no cars for that country. But because it's just a particular state, it kind of doesn't make sense, and you can just buy that car in a different state and then drive it in. Kind of doesn't make any sense, but my point being, again, my point there was just, it is another thing to consider that particular countries might have issue with it. Here in this country, technically speaking, there should be issues against modifying cars, and there are actually laws against it, but no cops have issues with it like whatsoever, or at least I've never come across a cop that has issues with it. I mean, if you're driving around like a dumbass, then yeah, of course, expect to be shat on and then get in trouble for everything that you've done. But for just driving around casually and just being like normal and respectful to the people on the road around you and to the officer himself who's now pulled you over, as long as you're nice, generally speaking, no issues whatsoever. From everything I've heard from people around the country, I know in Cape Town, that's basically the only place that apparently they can be kind of sticky with modifications. But again, I think it's more so like, oh, you're at a car meet, there's people revving up and like shooting flames and stuff. It can become an issue, and then the cops go there with the intent on finding issues to give you a ticket. Whilst if you're just casually driving around on the road and stuff, not so much in terms of issues. Finally, and this is a important one, is again, this can be a 50-50 shot, but from what I have heard, the community is obviously a very big thing in the car side of the world. Who's making noises? The community is a very large argument, and a lot of people argue that the built side is better than the bought side, because when you tend to get a couple million rands worth of a McLaren or something, the other people that you may meet who also have these cars might be a bit snobbish and a bit, yeah, so it's not necessarily the nicest people to deal with. Now, whilst a guy who's got a really clapped out cheap Miata might be super cool and a super chill dude, and he will sit down with you at a car meet and have a really nice long big discussion with you, and you get to sit and chat for like hours about your different cars and why you built them differently, and basically everything that we discussed in this episode. So it is a very big thing within it. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I do know obviously some supercar owners aren't like that. Some supercar owners are super friendly and super chill and more than happy for people to come and sit in their car, discuss their cars with them. They might actually be interested in tuner cars themselves. Some of them have both tuner cars and supercars because they're just super lucky, so on and so forth. So it kind of just depends on the situation. I know in this country, it is a bit of a snob faced for the higher end stuff. Again, though, it does depend on the car and it does depend on the owner. I know some people who work at sports car dealerships and themselves drive supercars, and they are really friendly and nice people. So, well, again, I say I know them. My dad knows them, and I kind of know them secondhand, and I know them very briefly, like for 5 seconds whilst I say hello, before I go look at another McLaren. So I can't really comment, but my point being, the community is a very big side of it, and can we please stop making noise? Thanks. Obviously being in the built community myself, I mean, one of the car meets I go to often, which is the Project Drive car meets, the amount of friendly people there is like ridiculous. Like there's a guy with a Mark III Supra that I've been speaking to recently. His son's just got a Miata, and he himself with his Mark III is super friendly and nice dude. And there's a whole bunch of other Miata people that I know and I invite to the community. Obviously there's like Callum that I know very well throughout the community and stuff, so I can comment on that side, is my point being. And I know them very friendly, though, irrelevant of the different classes of our cars. For example, there's guys there with FDRX7s and 800 horsepower Supras that can also be very friendly, although, as I have mentioned in a previous video, they can also land up being a bit snobbish and kind of a 50-50 shot again, to be 100% honest. But anyway, that actually ended up being a slightly longer video than I wanted it to be, but it kind of worked out nonetheless. So I hope you guys enjoy this video nonetheless, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. I'm going to be honest, I don't actually know what the topic for the next video is. If you have any other topics that you'd like me to discuss in these videos, or if you actually have anything better to call this than podcasting cars, because it's not really a podcast, let me know. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video next week Wednesday. Actually, well, I suppose Friday's video will be the next one you guys see. Hopefully, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Till then, guys, cheers.